What's up, everybody? It's your boy Montoya Smith, aka Black Socrates. We had an amazing show today, this morning on the Mental Dialogue Talk Show, 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time every Saturday. Our discussion question was, um, what is, slip my mind, what is CRT? Um, Something race theory. What's the C for? Critical race theory. That's it. So, what is critical race theory, and should it matter? My guests were amazing. Shelley Winters and my guest co-host Latrice Ross, and then Elisa Ward. She called in. Lisa Word. She called in, and we kept her on. And so we had this amazing show. And during the show, I shared um, a philosophy I learned from Bernard Kinsey. He and his wife, as I said on the show, they own the largest collection of African American art and artifacts in the country. And they came through Atlanta one time and they were traveling. And I shared this thing. I said I was going to hopefully break down on the show. And since I didn't get a chance to break it down on the show, I wanted to break it down here very briefly. Again, because I didn't get to do it on the show. Definitely recommend that you go and find Mental Dialogue on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Podbean, pretty much any um, podcast streaming entity that you're using. Just look up Mental Dialogue and you should find us there. But again, we just basically specialize in hard conversations on race, sex, and culture on the Mental Dialogue Talk Show. And today was a very high level intellectual dialogue. We didn't necessarily fall into debate, even though we had people on both sides of how they saw, in a sense, the critical race theory. And again, go listen to the show to hear that highly intellectual discussion. And again, it was a complete dialogue. The callers were amazing. So again, just really recommend that people hear, in my opinion, what the dialogue should be versus what you're hearing in the national news media, which is caught up into both sides to a degree, politicizing that issue versus being concerned about how we educate our children in a way that in a sense, we can unify better by understanding the actual history of this country. Because unfortunately, it is being misused. And the reality is, critical race theory is not something that's being taught at the middle school or high school levels. Um, but unfortunately, if you listen to the politics, you're being told that it is. But not to belabor the actual theory again, go listen to the show for that. I wanted to highlight the concept of colorblind versus color rich, which again we brought up on the show briefly, and I want to give a story that further and better explains this. So, as I said on the show, Bernard Kinsey mentioned at a when they came through Atlanta, I went and saw their tour or whatever, amazing tour, the artifacts that they carry. And it was a kind of a traveling tour, and I saw it some years ago. But Bernard Kinsey said years ago that one of the biggest mistakes that America made was the concept of pushing for color blindness, and said that we should have pushed to be color rich versus color blind. And many people have heard the concept of, especially for us as African Americans, colorblind to a degree is saying, hey, you don't, your culture, your race, in a sense, does not exist if you don't see me. And so we, in a sense, had this concept of the American melting pot of people pushing to be colorblind and say, hey, I don't see color. And the truth is, if you've seen, Jane Elliott talk about this or whatever, the truth is you do see color, and there's typically uh, something associated with it based on how you, in a sense, learned about other races within the country. So there's something associated with that color. So it's basically a falsehood to pretend to be colorblind. And so what Bernard Kinsey proposed and said we should have been aiming to be color rich. Color rich is basically the concept of recognizing, yes, there is some type of difference, whether it be race, ethnicity, religion, whatever the case may be, but in recognizing that difference, how might that difference affect how you view things, your perspective, or your culture on things? And so that if we had, in a sense, as a country, been aiming to be color rich, then we would not, in a sense, other people. If you've kind of heard that concept, like there's this concept humans pretty much have been divided throughout history over a various of issues because, in a sense, we are over here and the others are over there. And so, to a degree, since we demonize others because they're not like us, then you see conflict happen amongst humans quite often again over various issues, but particular in the United States. Race is a social construct that has been a an ongoing issue in this country, and so again, he encouraged that we become color rich. And what I said on the show was I wanted to give a perfect example of what he meant. And so in hearing that concept, I remember when I was in the Air Force, and my area of responsibility was the Middle East. And so, a perfect example of understanding what color rich is, if you will, is so when basically area responsibility was the Middle East. So in our training, trying to basically teach us about understanding cultural norms in the event that we might have negotiations or have to deal with basically there were, in a sense, allies that we would be on at particular bases, at different bases throughout the Middle East. And so the countries that we would go to, basically, we would have bases set up, in a sense, with our allies in the Middle East. And so they wanted us to understand cultural norms. And the example that I always remember was basically how as Americans we have this sense of space that in a sense that we consider normal or is required. We're real protective of our space in a way that a lot of other cultures are not. And so the example they gave is to understand that, for example, if we were riding on a public, maybe like a little short public bus, taking a trip somewhere. So if we were on a bus and we were the only one on the bus, only a couple people on the bus, don't be alarmed if when some people from another country in those countries, don't be alarmed if they got on the bus and they sit next to you and saying, because we're thinking like there's a whole empty bus, why would you sit in the, we would be natural, as Americans we would be like, why would you sit next to me when there's a bunch of empty seats? And the reason they might do that is because culturally, in their perspective, is actually inappropriate or offensive to not sit next to your brother, if you will, or your fellow countryman. So it's actually disrespectful. So because that is their cultural norm, they would sit next to you, and vice versa. Imagine if, in a sense, if they're in our country and we sent away, they would be offended. And so that was just a perfect example of, in a sense, if I'm aiming to be color rich and have an understanding of the culture, then if I'm sitting on an empty bus and someone from one of the Middle Eastern countries comes and sits next to me, then because I've been taught that cultural difference, then now I'm not upset. And you can imagine, it only takes one of you, in a sense, understanding the sense of culture to not be offended. But imagine if neither one of you knows, then you would be offensive unintendedly, because vice versa, they could be on a bus and you sit, go to the opposite seat or sit in the back, thinking that's actually the cultural thing to do, because in America, that's what we would do. You would actually be offensive to someone in their country. So I said on the show that I was going to give an example of what being color rich was, and to me that's the perfect example. And just want to share, you can imagine that there are all type of cultural differences, often sometimes related to a varied of issues. And another thing that I love to share, obviously, again, because we're in the United States and we're having this I would say unfortunate dialogue on critical race theory, because again, it's being misused politically. It's not something that's being pushed again at the middle school and high school level, but it's being misused. And again, go listen to the show for that. But the last thing that I would, in a sense, relay just on this topic when it comes to race, which again is a social construct made up by the elite and our forefathers in this country. No scientific or biological fact to any racial group having a hierarchy or being true, despite what you may hear. None of that's true from a scientific standpoint. And again, as a racial construct, it's something that's made up. But with that said, here's another way to just, I always like to share with people and highlight the concept of race. Ultimately, if you tell me where you live, whether it's in this country or some other place in this world, geography wise, I can tell way more about you than I ever could based on your racial makeup. And so, and the reason I love to point that out is because culturally, has way more effect than this made up construct of race. Unfortunately, in America, because it was founded under this racial construct, then there are real life consequences. So I'm not saying that in a sense because it's made up to just simply dismiss it. That's not, especially as as an African American, because there are racial consequences to this made up construct still being systemically a part of this country. So again, that's not that I don't explain that it's a construct to disregard it. However, the fact is that it is a social construct made up that in prior to the transatlantic slave trade, race was not used in the way that we understand it and know it today. At the most, your race might be shared just to explain where you are from. And then once you get into geography, you could take the United States alone, the South, the East, West Coast, the Midwest. If you wanted to guess at someone's cultural norms in those areas, you would end up being able to tell way more about them based on where they live in the country than you could based on them being black or white. So it just speaks to how shallow race that unfortunately does have, life or death consequences, or specifically in the past in this country, that is a very real thing since the racial construct played out that way. It was a money grab, but it's never been a real thing. But I just wanted to again just highlight again, color rich versus color blind. And at the end of the day, understanding someone else's culture and where they're from will actually help you understand them much better. They're in a sense, and we should not other people. At the end of the day, humankind, human race, believe it or not, it's all one based on science. And that's a real thing. But again, have to be respectful of the constructs that are still playing out. If we understood critical race theory, we could actually get rid of those things. But because it's being misused, I don't foresee us acting on critical race theory when it's being demonized in a unfortunate and unfair way currently. So that's all I got. So hopefully that was beneficial for anyone who wants to understand the example that I wasn't able to, give today on the show. But again, every Saturday morning we do these hard conversations on race, sex, and culture on the Mental Dialogue Talk Show. Catch it live, and you can call in on Blog Talk Radio every Saturday morning, and go to my Facebook page, Montoya Smith, or the Mental Dialogue Facebook page, and it's also in the bio on Instagram, mental_dialogue. With that said, if you like what we're doing and want to support what we're doing with the Mental Dialogue Community Club, please go to mentaldialogue.com and become a supporter. If you're in Atlanta, become a member and get invited to some of our exclusive Zoom events and exclusive events. And the Mental Dialogue Live experience, got to highlight that it's coming back real soon. But our next get together, our first official get together since the pandemic last year in March, will be June 26th at Jazz in the Alley, supporting the sister by the name of Ziggy, who puts that on every year. She's bringing that back down historic downtown Norcross, June 26th, 7:30 p.m. Go to the Mental Dialogue Meetup page if you're familiar with that, which is meetup.com/mental dialogue. And you can let us know that you're going to be a part of the event with us. We welcome everybody. Our ultimate mission is to create a nationwide virtual neighborhood where African Americans learn to trade ideas, goods, and services through paradigm shifting dialogues via social media, podcasts, and meetups. So look forward to you becoming part of our neighborhood. That's all I got. All I ask is that you think.